Go ahead and open your Bibles to Luke chapter 6. And I'm going to dispel all the rumors that have started about my finger. Most of which I started.
She break her finger?
Had nothing to do with a velociraptor. Nothing to do with an alien attack. Nothing to do with a zombie apocalypse. Last night, preparing for dinner, John and I were chatting while I was chopping some onions. The only reason I mentioned John is because he may have saved my life and kept the bleeding to a minimum. He did not distract me. It's not John's fault, but I did chop the tip of my finger off with a chopping knife. Not like the tip, like straight across here, but more at an angle. I did get fingernail and flesh. About the size of a half a dime, like a half inch in diameter. It was pretty cool. I chopped and I'm like under the water going, ow, ow. And John's like, you all right? And I'm like, I think I might have just chopped the tip of my finger off. And I look over at the cutting board and there's nothing there. I'm like, no, I'm all right. Nope, it's gone. And then we found it. And then Penny threw it away and it was on the floor. Well, it was gone. The cutting board was cleared off and it was on the floor, so we picked it up. John's got pictures if you want any pictures. Yeah, so it's self-inflicted wound. Yeah, self-inflicted wound. I did it to myself. Needless to say, I love sharp knives. Used to love sharp knives. You're in Luke chapter 6. We're going to carry on in our study in Luke. Today we'll be starting in chapter 6 and verse 1. On a Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Verse 6, on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered, not his left index finger missing parts. Though if any of you wants to heal on the Sabbath, I'm open. Verse 7, and the scribes and Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, but that they might find a reason to accuse him, But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. All right, so Jesus, in a couple accounts of a Sabbath, two different Sabbaths, and Luke telling us these two stories. The first thing that we want to try to level set so we're all on the same page is David. What did David do? When Jesus references King David here, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, are going to know exactly what he's talking about, but I dare say some of us don't. So the story can be found in 1 Samuel chapter 21. Don't bother turning there. I'm just going to tell you the story, but read it on your own if you'd like later. Remember, David was the second king of Israel, Saul being the first king of Israel. Saul, chosen by God to be king, had great potential to be king of Israel, but did not obey God, disobeyed God, flagrantly disobeyed God. And so God said he was going to choose another person to be king, a man after his own heart, David. So in the time period that we're talking about, that Jesus references, Saul is still king, and David knows that Saul is jealous of him and hates him and is trying to kill him. So David is fleeing from Saul, and he's running for his life. He's got this rabble of men with him, and they're all running from Saul, and they get to Nob. And they go to the priest at Nob, a guy named Ahimelech, and David says to the man, "Hey, we're on a special mission from the king. secret mission from the king, and we don't have any provisions. What do you have on hand? And the priest says, all I've got is the bread of the presence, which all of the teachers of Israel would know was only fit for the priests to eat. By law, the only people that could eat that bread were priests. David's not a priest. David says, well, can you give us some of that? And the priest says, are your men ceremonially clean? And David says, oh yeah, my guys always abstain from women when they're out on a mission, which I kind of doubt. But maybe he's telling the truth there, because he's already lied to get himself to where he is in saying that he's on a special secret mission from the king, because he's running from the king. He's not on a secret mission from the king unless you count it as a secret that he's running from the king. Okay, that may be true. So maybe he just played with words. But the priest gave David the bread to eat and gave it to David and his men. That's what Jesus references when he is questioned about doing something unlawful on the Sabbath. We're going to circle back to that in a minute. But ultimately, all of the priests at Nob died because of what David did here. Saul, being the jealous man that he was, killed or had someone else kill all of the priests at Nob because of what David did there. So now the question becomes, in verse 2, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, say, why are you doing what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath? And you notice how when they say, why are you doing something unlawful on the Sabbath, Jesus just references David. He never even acknowledges whether or not what he's doing is unlawful. So the question then becomes, was it unlawful for Jesus and his disciples to walk through grain fields, pluck some grain, rub it between their hands to get the chaff off of it, and then eat it? Was that unlawful? Well, it depends on what you consider unlawful or who you ask. Because there's two different laws that we're dealing with. One is just the Bible, and the other one is the Pharisaical law. They're different. The Pharisaical law is based on the biblical law, but it's bigger with more rules. So which law are they breaking? Well, I didn't know, so I looked it all up. And I checked every verse in the Old Testament that talks about Sabbath. Right? So the first thing that we remember about Sabbath is that God created the Sabbath as his own rest day, and then made it holy and said, we're to rest on it. That's back in Genesis chapter 2 or chapter 3. Then in Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments, God references the Sabbath there and says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And then in Deuteronomy 5, the second time that the Ten Commandments are listed out for us, same thing. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Well, then there's other references in the Old Testament that kind of help us understand what might or might not be lawful to do on the Sabbath. So in Exodus chapter 31, you don't need to go there. I'm just going to wrap through these really fast because there's a lot of them. Exodus 31, again, you could write the notes and read this later. Exodus 31, it says to keep the Sabbath and do no work. All right, so keep the Sabbath and do no work, or be put to death. Keep the Sabbath, do no work, or be put to death. So it's pretty extreme. Exodus 35 says there are 6 days for working, 1 day for resting. Do no work on that day, or guess what? Be put to death. Yeah. Oh, and do not light a fire. Do no work, do not light a fire. In Numbers chapter 15, verse 32 and following, there's a guy that's referenced who's out gathering wood on the Sabbath. He gets executed. So you can't light a fire or gather wood on the Sabbath. Aren't you all very grateful for automatic heat? Right? We don't have to worry about that at all. In 2 Kings chapter 11, there's a reference to the palace guards working on the Sabbath. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If you've got a king who has a palace and he has a guard, well, there's a reason he has a guard. It's to keep either his own people from killing him or other people coming in to kill him. What better way to make sure that your palace gets overrun every seventh day than to let all of your guards take the day off, right? It wouldn't be long before people got the word. They're like, well, you know what? They don't guard the place on the Sabbath. Yeah. They call it the Sabbath. I don't know what that's all about, but there's nobody guarding the place, so let's go. But there were guards that worked in the palace as palace guards on the Sabbath. You can imagine it was probably a rotational thing, so these guards worked this Sabbath, and then they had the next Sabbath off, but they worked on the Sabbath. In Nehemiah chapter 10, Nehemiah is gone to rebuild Jerusalem. They're rebuilding the wall and the temple and all that stuff. And Nehemiah warns the people that there should be no buying or selling on the Sabbath. Okay, they knew they weren't supposed to do any work, but now they can't buy or sell. And that's partly a reference to people coming from outside Jerusalem who are not Jewish and wanted to sell stuff to them, right? And so Nehemiah says, no, you can't buy any of their stuff. And they can't come in and be selling on the Sabbath. And don't you get the idea that you can sell or buy on the Sabbath. So no buying or selling. Nehemiah chapter 13 says that people were actually actively treading out wine, which means they were stomping on the grapes in the wine press, okay? They were stomping out wine. They were hauling grains, grapes, and figs. So they were hauling produce, right? While they were doing that, they were warned not to buy and sell on the Sabbath. But they were not warned, or were they killed, for treading out the grapes or hauling that other stuff through town. In Isaiah chapter 58, verse 13, God tells the people to keep their feet from breaking the Sabbath and to not do as you please. What does not, your feet not breaking the Sabbath, mean? Don't know. What does it mean to not do as you please? Does that mean you only like chop off tips of fingers? Because that was not pleasing. Jeremiah 17, God tells the people to be careful to not carry a load at all. Not carry a load out of their house or out of the city or through the city gate. And to keep the Sabbath holy by not doing any work. If they abide by that, God will bless Jerusalem. If they don't, he will rain fire down from heaven on them. So, biblically speaking, did the disciples and Jesus break a Sabbath law from the Bible in walking through the fields, rubbing the grain, and eating it? Well, did they do any work? Is that work? Is walking through a field, plucking grain, rubbing it between your hands, and eating it work? They weren't buying or selling. They were just rubbing and eating. Did they carry a load? Well, I don't know. Maybe. What's a load? Does it have to be something that makes you break a sweat, or is it just a load? Keep their feet from breaking the Sabbath. Did they walk too far that day? Does that mean you can't kick somebody in the head on the Sabbath? Or does that mean you can't walk a certain distance? What does that mean? Well, they weren't palace guards, right? So they didn't get a palace guard exemption. So whatever that was, they didn't get it. They weren't treading grapes, so they don't get that exemption. They weren't hauling produce. Well, maybe they were. So maybe they got the exemption there. Were Jesus and his disciples doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? It's kind of hard to tell biblically. Kind of hard to tell. I kind of think no. I kind of don't think that's what the Sabbath laws were about, against what they were doing. What about the Pharisaical law? Well, now given that the death penalty is instituted for breaking the Sabbath, and the Sabbath, as I just demonstrated to you, is somewhat vague as to what might get you killed and what might not, don't do any work. What does that mean? Right? It's understandable that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law might have said, you know what? I don't really know what it means for my feet to break the Sabbath. So I'm going to say we can't walk more than a mile on the Sabbath, and then we'll call it good. Or I'm going to say that we can't walk any further than from my house to synagogue on the Sabbath. Because that's necessary. I need to do that, right? But any further than that, we'll end back. Otherwise, you just stay there for the rest of your life. Any further than that, and it's breaking the Sabbath. So they start to set up boundaries around what Sabbath laws look like so that they can be sure not to break them. Now, like I said, I get that. If for instance, Frank here became the Lord of Denslow someday, somehow, Master of Denslow, Lord of Denslow, with power of life and death over all that goes on Denslow, and he says to me, Bill, I want you to clean the street. And then he walks off. Or he just writes me a note. Bill, clean the street. Lord, Frank. And so I'm going to clean the street. I might jack the street sweeper from the city and sweep my street with it, then mop my street with it, because if I don't do it to his demand, I die. I might even clean all the way up to people's front doors, just in case he thinks that's part of his street. And since he just said street, I might clean more than Denslow. He might have meant Valley, or Southworth, or Winston. So I'm going to clean, and I'm going to clean, and I'm going to clean until he comes along and says, Bill, you've cleaned enough. So I get the idea behind, since it's the death penalty, I'm going to put some boundaries on what it means to break the Sabbath. And I'm going to be really, really narrow. Because I don't want fire coming down from heaven on me, or Frank in this case, because I didn't clean the street well enough. Right? So I get where they're coming from. And as they looked at the Sabbath, they said, you can't reap, you can't harvest, you can't winnow, which is really rubbing the grain between your hands to get the chaff off so you can eat it, and you can't prepare food. That's preparing food. So were they breaking a law of the Pharisees? Arguably, yes. Arguably, yes. Maybe not. Arguably, they were. What does Jesus reply? In verse 3, why are you doing what is unlawful, they ask. He says, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. So Jesus says, they say, why are you doing what's unlawful? And he says, haven't you heard of David, who broke this law a long, long time ago, who you, teachers of the law, revere as one of the top 3 or 4 guys in all of Israel for all of time? King David. He broke a law doing that day. But he doesn't really say that. He doesn't say, look at what David did, that scoundrel. And that way this is okay. What we're doing is okay. I think what he's doing here is he takes this moment to have a teaching moment. And he instructs the teachers of the law and all who are listening about some things. So what did Jesus instruct? What did he teach in this instance? The first thing that he taught was meeting tangible needs can override religious code. Meeting tangible needs can override religious code. So, thinking of David, in the story of David, we've got a priest who knows that the bread of the presence is for him and the other priests, not for David and the men. But they have a legitimate need. They're on a mission, he's told, from God, from the king. A secret mission, and they have no provisions. They have a tangible need that he meets. In violation of the law, but he meets it. And so there are scholars who believe that this kind of thing may have occurred often, maybe not regularly, maybe not every week, or not every time they put out the showbread or the presence bread, but that there was a time when, okay, here's the bread of the presence, and here's somebody who needs it. The priests don't need it right now, but they do. Let's give it to them. So it's one thing that Jesus, I think, is teaching us here, is that meeting a tangible need can override religious code. It doesn't always override religious code, okay? And we can't always use religious code to say, well, I can't do that thing because of this law. Which gets us to the second point, the second thing I think he's teaching us, and that is it's always good to do good. It's always good to do good. That's our second story that Luke tells about Jesus here. The man with the withered hand. The teachers of the law, the Pharisees, they're watching Jesus. They see the guy with the withered hand in the synagogue that day on the Sabbath, and they're watching Jesus to see if he would heal. Clearly a good thing. They're watching to see if he would do it. And he does. And what he says is it right to do good on the Sabbath or harm? Is it right to kill on the Sabbath or to give life? And so he's saying it's always good to do good. Don't let your religious code hold you back from doing what you know to be good. It's always good to do good. So Jesus is teaching in this moment. He takes the opportunity to tell a story about David, and he's teaching us something. And what he says meeting a tangible need can override religious code. And he says that it's always good to do good. And the third thing is what Jesus says about the Sabbath is all that matters. What Jesus says about the Sabbath is all that matters. Not the rules and the codes that the religious leaders of the day had established. Not what anybody but God, the creator of the Sabbath, says. That's what matters on the Sabbath. Jesus says he is Lord of the Sabbath in verse 5. He is master of the Sabbath. If Jesus says picking grain, rubbing it between your hands, and eating it on the Sabbath while walking through the grain field is okay, it's okay. In Mark chapter 2 and verse 27, Jesus goes a little further and he says that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The religious leaders had taken that and turned it completely upside down and made the Sabbath all about serving the Sabbath and made a whole bunch of rules that man needed to adhere to while keeping the Sabbath. But the Sabbath was for man, not the other way around. God did not create the Sabbath for us to serve, but created the Sabbath to serve us. Which begs the question, what is the Sabbath all about? Well, on the back of your page, there's 4 things that I want to talk about related to Sabbath. The first thing, Sabbath is about rest. Rest. We see that in Genesis chapter 2 and Exodus chapter 20. In Genesis chapter 2, God rested from his work. God rested from his work. He didn't need to rest. He's God. He rested from his work, and then he told us that we were to do the same thing, rest from our work. And in Exodus chapter 20, in the first instance of the 10 Commandments being named, verses 8 to 11, it says, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, for God worked for 6 days, then he rested, and you too are to work 6 days and rest. That's the Roulier paraphrase, by the way. But in Deuteronomy, or in Exodus chapter 20, it's all about God rested, you need to rest. It's all about rest. So the Sabbath is about rest. The second thing the Sabbath is about is remember. Remember. In the second time that the 10 Commandments are laid out for us in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, it talks about the Sabbath. Again, it starts off with remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But then it talks about how they were once slaves in Israel. It says that everybody needs to rest that day, even the slave among them, because they were slaves once in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. And God is saying to them, remember what I have done for you as part of this keep the Sabbath holy thing. Remember what I have done for you. Take a day to rest and remember God. Remember what he's done. This is our opportunity as people who were not in slavery in Egypt, but we were in slavery to sin, to stop, take a day and rest and remember that God has released us from slavery to sin. He's freed us from the slavery to sin. He sent Jesus, his only son, because he loved us so much, to die in our place, giving us the righteousness of Christ, giving us the ability to no longer sin, to live free from sin, out of the bondage of sin. We can reflect on that on the Sabbath. I think that we all would have a lot easier time dealing with sin and temptation if we set aside at least one day during the week when we focused on the gospel and what Jesus did for us and remembered that he's made us new. He doesn't call us anything but reborn, new creatures, children of the King. That's who we are. And if we focused on that, I think at least one day a week, it would change how we reacted to sin and temptation, because then we would be able to say, yes, thank you, Jesus. You've given me the ability to not go there. So rest, remember, trust. Do no work on the Sabbath. When God rained down manna from heaven in Exodus chapter 16, he told them that they could gather for 6 days, but not gather on the Sabbath. And that if they gathered too much on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it would rot, become wormy before morning. And so if they gathered too much, more than they really needed, then it would rot. But they should trust God and gather twice as much on on Friday, I guess, for them, right? Gather twice as much, and it would be good all the way through the Sabbath so that they didn't have to gather or work. They needed to trust God that he was going to provide on the Sabbath, because on the Sabbath, nothing came. There was nothing there for them to eat. Likewise, we in our workaholic kind of natures and community and society work and work and work and work and work and work and never take that day of Sabbath that God commands us to take, because we don't trust him to deal with it if we stop and just spend time with him for a day. We don't trust that he will deal with either our finances or the stuff that we're worried about falling apart all around us. We don't trust God enough to take that day. And finally, the Sabbath was created for our benefit, not the other way around. The Sabbath was created and commanded that we follow for us. We are wired in such a way by God, the Creator, to work 6 days and take a day off. We're wired that way. And when we don't, when we ignore him, we wear ourselves down. We maybe come to the point of complete, utter exhaustion, burnout. It's for our benefit that he created the Sabbath. Not that we would serve it, but that it would serve us. The flip side to that is we were created for work. So the other 6 days we're supposed to be working. It's not a 7-day Sabbath, every week. Okay, so what did Jesus teach us here in this passage? Meeting a tangible need can override religious code. It's always good to do good. What he says about the Sabbath is all that really matters. And then 4, obedience to God is greater than obedience to tradition. Obedience to God is greater than obedience to tradition. At the heart of both of these stories is obeying the greater command to love. To love people in need, to love those people around you. And in the disciples, it was, the Pharisees just wanting to judge the disciples and Jesus for picking grain. No grace, no love, just judgment. And so the lesson for us is obeying God's greater command to love is greater than obeying certainly man-made traditions. So I think it's important for us to examine why it is we do the things we do, the things we don't do. Why do we do those things? Why do we not do those things? Why do we draw the line here or there? Why do we do those things? Is it religious code established by man or ourselves? Or is it the Bible? Is it something that the Bible decrees, or is it something I've made up? And is it something that is so important to the Bible that I can't do good to break it? Now, don't get the idea that it's okay to always lie like David did, right? David got a whole bunch of people killed that day. What the priest did was the right thing by doing good for somebody who he believed had a legitimate need. David, not so cool. Is it okay sometimes to lie for the good of someone? Well, yeah, like if somebody's killing a certain group of people, like Jews in Nazi Germany, yeah, it's okay in that instance to lie and cover up for people who are running for their lives. But that does not mean we get to lie all the time for our own good, right? Because something bad's going to happen to me if I tell the truth. That's never the case. Own up. Tell the truth. Don't get confused about that. Obedience to God is always greater than obedience to tradition. Our final lesson from Jesus here is be one who can be accused of doing good. That's what the religious leaders of the day focused in on, right? Verse 6, on another Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. They knew Jesus' character. They knew Jesus as the healer. They knew Jesus as somebody who cared about physical infirmities, maybe more than keeping the Sabbath. So they were going to pick on that and watch that so that they could accuse him of doing something wrong. Similarly, in Daniel in the Old Testament, when some people didn't like Daniel, they got the king to issue a decree. And the only thing that they could think of that would get Daniel in trouble would be something that had to do with following his God. And so they got a decree made that you could only pray to their God, not other gods. And Daniel just continued to pray like he always did and got himself in trouble because of it. They picked on the only thing that they could come up with, and that was because he was following his God in such a way that they knew he wouldn't stop. We need to be people who we should be able to be accused by those outside of being the people who always do good. I would love it if somewhere along the line somebody from outside said those DCC people, they're always just up to good. Amen. Like it's an accusation, like it's bad. They're always just up to good. Be one who is accused of doing good. In contrast to verse 11 and the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, who were looking for a way to trick Jesus into doing some good, and then being furious about him actually doing it and looking for a way to do something to him. Is it okay on the Sabbath to heal or to kill? Well, yeah, they went out to destroy Jesus. They start to plot. All right, so meeting tangible needs can overrule religious code. It's always good to do good. What Jesus says about the Sabbath is really all that matters. Obedience to God is greater than obedience to tradition. Be one who can be accused of doing good. It's always right to care for people. Let's pray.